Invasion Audiobook, Part 13. Battling their way forward, street by street, house by house. Doing this, block by grueling block, was causing immense destruction as the combo of rockets, shells, missiles, and huge caliber bullets left the homes and buildings in ruined husks of their former selves, or left them extremely pockmarked at the very least, at bare minimum. Pvt Li Chung's battalion of mechanized infantry had struggled for supremacy in the northeastern suburbs, having had engaged American forces in the immediate vicinity for many hours, having had moved slowly and methodically through their area designated to them, whereby they were to clear and outflank enemy-held positions in the outermost northeastern suburbs, now facing due west. In an east-west facing street, Lee's company of his battalion, one of 8 comprising it, now took a temporary pause to resupply. This just prior to repressing the attack by 11 p.m. on day 1 of the invasion to continue on into Silver Spring, a suburb just to the west, the purpose of which was to connect with elements of the other 2 mechanized infantry battalions, both of which had moved southwest upon completing the earlier conquest of Fort Meade, striking deep into the metro area earlier in the day on day 1. By now, leading elements of the aforementioned other 2 battalions began to cross the actual city limits of the cap city itself, causing major panic amongst the defenders, who quickly rushed all available assets and troops to plug the gaps in the defensive line. Insofar as vehicles and forces available, it largely hinged upon a mixture of MRAPs, Strykers, and up-armored Humvees, with a motley crew of alphabet paramilitary SWAT elements and mixed military forces comprising local guard units and naval forces and airmen, with whatever remnants of the shattered army forces of active duty forces that successfully had earlier evacuated, retreating into the city from the ring of installations that had ringed it, all now overrun on day 1 of the invasion. By now, the Type 63s and ZBD-04s of Pvt Li Chung's company all sat in a staggered formation on the street, gunners carrying out 360-degree security, with each watching a different sector. Lee had switched positions, now serving as a dismount. He and his friend, Private Quing, now sat in the back of the Type 63's crew cab. They had just received fuel via having their containers fueled up. They had to use them to gas up the vehicle before finally topping them off once their armor personnel carrier was all the way green on fuel, in quotes. Ammo was also delivered in the previous 2 hours, along with water and another box of MREs per vehicle, all dropped off by their company's headquarters platoon, itself having had made the runs of the fuel containers back to the nearest fueler truck and logistical depot. This all sat about 8 miles away upon a CCP farm they'd passed earlier in the day. Radio checks and status reports for all vehicles were now carried out. All vehicles reported green on everything, allowing the company captain to relay orders to his subordinate lieutenants on down to the non-commissioned officers who ordered their vehicles to move from a staggered security formation into a single column. This so they could continue proceeding down the street a relatively short distance where they were to cross a bridge across the Anacostia River and on into Silver Spring to connect with elements of the other 2 battalions, as earlier mentioned. The 2 having had moved as far as the outer city limits of the Cap City itself. Pvt Li, as a dismount within his squad, was now about to see even more combat. Moreover, not only was Lee's company headed for the bridge, but so was a group of combat-fatigued American forces attempting to flee further southwest, seeking the relative security of the recently established first defensive line of the city, hastily thrown up by the ragtag defenders from throughout the metro area's bases, all lay within its borders. Those particular American forces now lay in a pocket recently created mere hours ago by Pvt Li's battalion and the Air Defense Artillery Battalion securing the supply routes, as well as the Tank Battalion from the 93rd Infantry Division, another of the 31st Group Army's several divisions that comprised it, along with its Electronic Warfare Regiment and single independent headquarters battalion serving as the entire 31st Group Army's headquarters unit, separate from all its subordinate units. In 10 minutes, Lee's spearheading company, moving towards the bridge, moved slowly, now began encountering shots fired. Tracers flew by, coming from the river area near the bridge, some 300 meters away. Move! Dismount! Wedge! Right! yelled the squad sergeant, as loud as he could manage. His voice, already extremely hoarse from tirades of earlier commands rendered during earlier combat. The W-85s on the turrets of all the armor personnel carriers began to fire devastating bursts of the massive 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun rounds, sending them flying through the night towards the river and bridge. All the PL troops used their nods or their NVGs. It was like watching a laser light show, as small blasts from 30 millimeter ammo, tracers, and grenades and anti-tank rockets, as well as American AT-4 recoilless shells, beginning to fly, impact, and blast all over the place. Many buildings on both sides of the river began to see chunks and pieces blown off or out of them in many different directions. Many vehicles of civilian varieties had been used earlier to make many sorts of makeshift barricades, intermixed with sandbag emplacements, also hastily constructed earlier to where one could tell it wasn't fully completed, as the defenders had been forced to fight or to flee from various assaults or artillery strikes from rockets of the 30 or of the 130 millimeter variety. Strikes had been used from one of the fire support companies belonging to one of the two other mechanized infantry battalions that Pvt Li's battalion was to make contact with. They just needed to clear the bridge to proceed to their next objective. However, the Americans were now throwing up a stubborn resistance, largely of a desperation to escape being surrounded by all of the PLA troops advancing through the area, causing them to become trapped into a deadly pocket, a pocket they now fought desperately to escape. These Americans neither wanted to be captured or to be annihilated in cold blood. Lee had formed into a wedge along with his squad, who now bounded from behind the relative safety of their armor personnel carrier, all stopping to take cover alongside the street, now taking cover in rubble formed by earlier rocket strikes hitting a large office building along the corner of the street, where the avenue along the river's east bank intersected with the current street and bridge upon which Lee's company now found itself. Shells were called in from Lee's own battalion's fire support company. This company had a platoon of 5 PLL-05 assault gun/mortars, able to be used in either direct or in mortar fire support missions. This and 2 other platoons of that company operated 130 millimeter rocket artillery, and its headquarters platoon, of course, handled its logistics. The 120 millimeter shells flew in from above as mortars, scoring direct hits on several American positions adjacent to the bridge, found by quadcopter recon drones, logging their coordinates. The wise American forces stayed moving, or chose to remain well hidden to avoid a similar fate. Lee was firing his rifle, along with the other men, including those with light machine guns and light anti-tank weapons, or mounted grenade launchers upon barrels, putting down heavy volumes of continuous fire. Although the Americans fought back as best as they could, all of the intersecting fire from the deadly ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicles, the turret machine gunners on the W-85 heavy machine guns, the dismounts, and the 120 millimeter shells raining down upon them, was too intense to truly safely lift their heads and return adequate fire. "Now! Go! We got him!" yelled Lee's squad's sergeant as he received orders on his headset to move his squad forward. They bounded to the next cover and concealment point, a cluster of blasted, burned up hulks of twisted metal that were once civilian vehicles. Other squads continued, laying fire to cover their movement, as all the dismounted troops made for the river, taking quick, short bounds to get there. This being done to minimize the potential for casualties as they moved forward. Enemy fire died down drastically as the combined might of the precision light artillery coupled with the sheer intensity of fire being laid down by Lee's company ensured the attrition rate remained extremely lopsided and unfair. However, it wasn't quite over yet. The American forces, though sufficiently battered, had some tricks of their own. As a 240 Bravo machine gunner took position in a smashed building on the other side of the bridge, along with snipers and a few squads of men with more anti-tank weapons, including some of the Javelin variety, a tow system, and the standard AT-4s by which the majority was equipped with. The small quadcopter recon drone was then lit up by the 240 Bravo machine gun as it hovered slowly while shifting positions to then scan the area for hidden enemies along the riverbank, having dropped low and slow enough in an attempt to survey the area more thoroughly. Now that the drone was blasted to pieces, calling in precise coordinates on the Americans would be drastically more arduous of a process, giving them more wiggle room for safer maneuver. This infuriated the company captain upon hearing of this, causing him to order Lee's platoon of the company to seize the bridge at all costs, including the clearance of the area immediately across it on the west bank of the river, establishing a 200-meter bridgehead perimeter once across. Lee's squad's sergeant received the orders and relayed them to the men. They raised up from behind their previous position and charged along with another of the squads, also in their wedge, as the two other squads of the platoon covered them while they charged to the riverbank and bridge. There was a concrete abutment and small wall on each side of the bridge. It was relatively short, but was topped with sandbags in some spots, hastily placed earlier by the defenders, but then abandoned. "Oof!" gasped Private Lee as his body slammed up against the wall. This, upon having had fired a few quick bursts from his QBZ-03 rifle, as suppressing fire whilst running. "Grenade! Frag out!" yelled a fellow private, while tossing one over the wall and into the riverbank below. As a clearing measure, in case of possible enemies there. Came its blast and quick rumbling shake. Next, the squad sergeant ordered the men to pop up in random pairs by every other man in the 10-man dismounted squad taking turns to raise up and fire 2 to 3 second bursts, 5, then 5 of every other man along the wall, doing this all at once in those intervals. Holding the wall was of obvious tactical significance, but the real objective was to obtain the locations of the enemy positions by getting them to reveal themselves upon taking return fire against their positions. While doing this, the armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, setting back a somewhat safer distance, were to return fire with their even heavier, longer-ranged, more powerful weapons. The company captain was extremely hesitant to move his heavier assets forward until he was certain that the enemy had no effective anti-armor weapons remaining that could devastate his forces and create extreme losses. Tactically, in urban warfare situations, using dismounts ahead of armored vehicles to clear the way ahead, whilst also using heavier weapons aboard the vehicles as a mobile fire support platform, tended to work the best in situations such as these. Although tactics could be adapted to where it could be more effective to bring forward these vehicles to where they could then either become rolling shields for the dismounts or just have the troops mount up completely inside for transport. All of which depended upon anti-tank weapons the enemy was in possession of, or terrain such as urban canyons versus open rural fields and woods. In this situation, the dismounts needed to prod and clear ahead, while the big guns sat back and gave them fire support. The ZBD-04's 30mm and even larger 100mm cannons devastated all in their path, and the 12.7mm machine guns on the armor personnel carriers also served as street sweepers in the truest sense of the term. While many of the infamous depth perception issues inherent with older NVG nods had been resolved in newer models, Pvt Li still found them clunky and annoying to wear while fighting, as it made aiming his rifle more effectively into quite a chore. Hundreds of hours spent in many training ranges back home in China, where his unit trained, helped him do the best he could with it. Although nonetheless, it was still extremely bothersome for him. He raised up, fired another few bursts, and was instantaneously knocked on his ass, smacked in his chest plate of his IBA, or armored vest, causing him to gasp from the pain of cracked ribs. Lee had been hit by a 7.62 by 51mm NATO round, which came from an American sniper hiding on one of the former second floors of one of the blown out and gutted commercial buildings along the West Bank's Avenue. Most likely, this sniper used an M24 rifle, essentially a bolt-action Remington Model 700, designated the M24 in the Army's use. Lee had been caught in the chest, likely due to his moving back to cover a second too late, which caused him to take a round to the chest instead of head, as the sniper had the timing wrong in anticipation that his head would be in that spot, taking the shot and merely hitting his chest due to Lee's extra second of firing. "Medic!" yelled Lee's sergeant of his squad as he stopped shooting, running to check on Private Lee. Lee's sergeant was a superb non-commissioned officer who did exactly as any good NCO would, taking care of his men under his command. "Lee, talk to me! Can you speak? Where are you hit?" yelled the sergeant in obvious deep concern for Private Lee. "Oh, my chest, Sergeant. It hurts, but I think my vest caught it. Ribs sore. Sharp pain," gasped Private Lee as he rolled over, trying to reposition himself, as two rounds hit the pavement nearby. "No, don't move! Stay down!" yelled the sergeant before rolling Private Lee a bit closer to the wall, so he would be safer from higher angle shots from second or third floor buildings remaining across the river. Just then came the two medics from headquarters platoon, who crouched as low as they could, putting their hands through Lee's vest from the shoulder arm openings, checking for blood or any sort of wounding. "No penetration of the vest, but you need meds for your cracked ribs," said one of the medics, who grabbed Lee's arm and carried out an injection of morphine to get Private Lee back in operating shape. "If pain persists, we'll take you back to the aid station," said the other medic, before both ran off to tend to other issues for them. Just then, another man had taken a round to the shoulder, blowing out bone, muscle tissue, and all manner of gore, causing them to radio headquarters platoon to ready their ambulance MRAP for a medivac, and for a third medic to bring a fold-up stretcher with saline bags. Lee began to feel relief with his ribs. His sergeant grabbed Lee's shoulder, guiding him back to a more safe position along the wall. "Hey, don't need you dying on me. That'll slow you down, that medicine," said the sergeant as he popped up quick to let loose a single burst of rifle fire before dropping back down to speak to Lee again. "Listen, do what I tell you when I tell you. Understand? Need to know that your reflexes are still there. If they aren't, then your combat ineffective, and that's potentially dangerous," stated the sergeant to Private Lee. "Roger, Sergeant," Lee replied, showing that he understood. Private Lee held his current position along the wall, watching the hellscape continually erupting all around him. The rest of his squad and other 3 squads popping up and down, laying fire, causing Americans to give away their positions and causing the company's heavy weapons of the infantry fighting vehicles and armor personnel carriers to fire back upon the betrayed enemy positions, annihilating some, though not all, within this particular instance of savage, destructive, seemingly apocalyptic urban warfare battle for this single bridge across the Anacostia River in the Cap City's outer suburbs. While the defenders' luck was running out, this exchange was simply a small taste of what was to come upon PLA and other Allied forces clashing with 3 rings of defense in the city. These, whereby the defenders had been feverishly hurrying to build rugged defensive barriers that incorporated everything from huge public buildings to office buildings to husks and shells of what once were homes, city blocks, and other types of commercial structures, now reduced to utter ruins. Even using the metro line as a shelter for civilians, wounded forces, logistics, and supply routes, and even to shuffle forces around safely and hidden from satellite, drone, and aircraft recon. All of these things combined were extremely reminiscent of the Bttle of Berlin in 1945, when the epic climactic battle occurred in World War II, the struggle for the capital of Germany at the end of the war. America's Cap City was now undergoing such a similar fate. The parallels were not lost upon those who have studied history. "Go! Charge the bridge! Now!" yelled the squad sergeant of Lee's squad upon having received the order from the platoon sergeant via the radio headset in his helmet. This, upon the armor personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and also the called-in fire support from the 120 millimeter gun mortars of the fire support company of the battalion, lobbing shells from roughly 1 kilometer away upon being radioed the approximate coordinates of American positions. Upon all the received return fire from them, allowing Lee's company to do a rough triangulation of where they were exactly firing from. The prior minor barrage, or prior major barrage of 120 millimeter and 100 millimeter and 30 millimeter shells of the assault gun mortars of the distant fire support company of the battalion, coupled with the ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicles firing all they had, including the 2 HJ-12 anti-tank missiles from their turret pods, annihilated the building husks into straight rubble piles that were 2 floors tall. By the time it ceased for the dismounts to charge, the area seemed as if it had been nuked, although it was all merely the work of various conventional weapons working in concert, all gradually ripping the remains of buildings to tiny pieces of rubbled ruins, piles of brick, concrete, and other random building materials, and twisted beams and former plumbing. Though Lee suffered mildly from continually feeling squeezed by his armor due to his rib injury, the medics did make it more tolerable as he bounded now with the others in his squad. Bodies and body parts lay strewn about within the streets and amongst the rubble. It was a macabre, gruesome scene. Even in the river, corpses stuck on rocks in the river or bobbing in the water could be seen as he charged out of the corner of his eyes through the rail guards of the bridge itself. One of his comrades, another private, stopped and pulled his Type 69 anti-tank rocket tube from behind his back, preloaded with an anti-personnel fragmentation rocket. He quickly took steady aim, crouching on one knee, and sent a rocket sailing from his position behind the charred, twisted metal of a burned-up former vehicle. He then reslung it behind his back, re-shouldered the rifle, continuing to shoot. Upon his fragmentation round hitting a pile of rubble, a bit taller than the one in front of it, which formed a good cover and concealment position for the enemy. However, when the round detonated, it threw several limbs into the air from whoever hid in the rubble ditch created by all the earlier shelling and bombardments. All the while, as that happened, everyone else continued charging forward, still in a wedge formation, albeit more narrow due to the space limitations caused by the bridge. One American gave away his position, and immediately upon rising up from behind another heap of rubble to fire an AT-4, got instantly smacked in the head through his helmet by light machine gun fire from another soldier, a corporal in Lee's squad, who fired a burst of perhaps 20 rounds of 5.8 by 42 millimeter belted rifle ammo through his Type 88 light machine gun. It happened so quick and on the move to where most probably missed the target, save for maybe 3 to 4 passing through the man's skull through his helmet, causing his head to violently snap back as he fell backwards, inadvertently still firing his AT-4 simultaneously as he was hit, although it flew far off target, hitting the previous wall that they'd emerged from behind in order to charge the bridge, blasting out a small chunk of the reinforced concrete. Though a relief that the AT-4 sailed harmlessly into that wall along the east bank behind them, it caused the non-commissioned officers of all the squads to caution all their men to watch out for any enemies potentially wielding anti-armor weapons. What they didn't know was there was one tiny group of American survivors who pulled back out of the area as the earlier barrages occurred mere minutes earlier. As they stayed back a few streets, they prepared a plan to use the 3 javelins and the 1 tow system they'd managed to evacuate the area with to use the canyons of rubble from all the shelling to carefully sneak back in, hidden amid it, and to wait for the Chi-Com vehicles to sit on the bridge before hitting them with the missiles as they tried crossing. For now, the fighting had wound down quite a bit, with only an occasional single survivor here or there being ran down by the PLA. in the occurring security sweeps now being done to prepare the way for the company's vehicles to cross without incident, peril from potential anti-tank strikes. Most of the Americans were KIA'd, while several were captured, especially those wounded or isolated in primitive cover and concealment positions. Of the wounded in action, they were given medical treatment and actually treated with dignity. Even the brutal people armed police fanatics, had they been here instead of the PLA troops, would have done similar, as they didn't willingly give up the Americans. They didn't willingly give up, but were injured while fighting the Chinese. Chinese cultural codes demanded such be permitted, more dignity than weak cowards who would willingly surrender. However, the PLA, unlike the brutal PAP, mostly adhered to Geneva Conventions-like conduct, although they crafted their own, as China felt it was superior to all nations and peoples, and according to its culture, was to how POWs and slaves were to be treated. As for the PLA's POWs, the able-bodied became slaves. The injured would be treated and sent to special Lao guys. The PAP, however, would eliminate the able-bodied, unless ordered not to, but would spare the wounded, as they were seen as having more honor as they tried to fight. Sergeant Richardson, along with the 2 airmen he'd found earlier, began to move frantically through the streets and alleyways. Although an arduous process it all was. "Hold! Let me check the street. Make sure we can make it across," said Sergeant Richardson in a gruff, commanding voice, although extremely hoarse from all the constant yelling from earlier. He could still be heard amid all of the blasting and rattling of small arms fire reverberating throughout the city, now a mere heap of ruinous canyons of rubble and shells of what were once imposing public buildings, offices, and also residential areas. He peered his head from around the corner of another concealed walkway between 2 row homes. Endless scenes of demise and destruction ever more gripped his senses. Seeing more corpses dismembered, burned, and strewn about amid wreckage of former vehicles and rubbled buildings. The fire of machine guns and rifles were now heard at an even more intense volume upon his peering to see if the coast was clear. This from beyond the formerly muffled walkway. Chi-coms battling scattered American forces over homes and rubble piles that were homes at one time upon this particular street. He'd immediately been spotted and fired at by a whole squad of PLA troops conducting a right-facing rolling shield maneuver from the left side of one of their APCs. The rear-facing members covering their back, yelling and firing at Sergeant Richardson, alerting many other PLA troops in the immediate vicinity to his presence in the area. Although somewhat fortunate for Sergeant Richardson and the 2 airmen behind him, who who he had earlier found hiding in the backyard of a home. The overall chaos of the battle already occurring allowed for them to be engaged by merely the rear-facing troops of the whole formation, as the rest already were engaging American forces held up in the nearest homes to their current positions. "Back! Back now! Go!" yelled Sergeant Richardson, upon firing several rounds from his rifle around the corner, while beginning to turn to lead the other two men with him back from whence they came. "We can't cross here. We gotta try another way. Maybe 2 blocks to the north," shouted Sergeant Richardson, as he and the two with him bolted as fast as humanly possible back into the backyard, then back into the last alleyway they'd just recently crossed. Running between the opposite-facing backyards of 2 blocks of row homes, each facing different streets, with this alleyway running between the backyards of each set of row homes. They'd already moved so far by then, since he'd met up with the 2 airmen that were present with him currently. To and fro, several blocks worth of movement, albeit like a maze. In real terms, the station for the metro line was only 1.5 blocks away. But they'd been forced to move up and down, largely parallel to where they'd actually intended on going. This was due to seeking a safer route by which it was passable and safely passable in order to avoid being blasted or shot to pieces by all of the combat going on all around them, as Chi-Coms penetrated deep into the city, with already on day 1 of the invasion, leading companies of 2 battalions had penetrated as deep as the cap cities, city limits themselves, before finally hitting the first defense lines, now hastily thrown together at the last minute, before a second and even third belt of defense lines could also be cobbled together just behind the first defense line. While the first wouldn't last long into the second day of the invasion, the second defense line would end up being the most formidable of the 3, with the third being more of a last stand sort of positioning for the defenders. Merely one final defiant gesture and posturing, more as a means by which to buy time and spite the Chinese and their allies, than as an actual solid means by which to defeat them or even turn things around. As the 3 men ran back into the alley, they seen civilians fleeing in tiny groups in pure panic mode as they tried to seek shelter and refuge from all of the erupting doom all around them. The 3 men even passed 2 smaller groups of American forces who opted to tag along with them, now bringing their original 3 men to a full-size squad of 10 troops. Everything was chaotic. No clear leadership, unless it was a line of sight sort of situation, as having no effective communications made organization and coordination a complete, total headache. It all began to deteriorate in this part of the greater metro area as the PLA began to fully subdue much of the outer suburbs by the end of day one of the invasion. None of them truly had enough ammo on their person for the current task at hand, nor really any effective weaponry by which to deal with the type of overt damage, or by which to deal the type of overt damage to the enemy by which they could feasibly clear a path. Only Sergeant Richardson had anything resembling an effective anti-armor weapon, but his one single anti-tank weapon, his AT-4, he'd managed to acquire earlier, was all that he had, and thus needed to be extremely sparing with when he would deploy it, reserving it for an extreme emergency situation only. The others, at very best, had hand grenades, and at worst, tiny amounts of rifle and or pistol ammo on them. All the fighting and lack of access to the established logistical points throughout the city caused them to become gradually depleted of their ammo from being cut off from logistical areas by enemy PLA forces that were blocking the way to such areas. By midnight, beginning of day 2 of the invasion, the suburb of Silver Spring was about to completely fall to the PLA. It couldn't physically be held onto for very much longer, under the intense firepower and large forces brought to bear into the outer suburbs, especially in the northern suburbs. However, the PLA ran into vastly more organized and heavier resistance in the eastern suburbs, causing them to relentlessly shell, rocket, mortar, missile, and conduct precision airstrikes and even carpet munitionings of these areas to where nothing remained insofar as buildings were concerned. Although the whole city itself was laid waste to, the eastern suburbs and the cap city itself, within the city limits, took the worst of it all, while other areas were heavily damaged, but scattered buildings did remain that avoided being totally gutted or pulverized into dust completely. It was a macabre, morbid, cruel hellscape, one that words couldn't accurately articulate or describe. Of the 10 men now with Sergeant Richardson, some had night vision goggles, several didn't, due to a variety of reasons considering the current circumstances. They'd finally found somewhat of a more quiet zone, one where dismounted PLA troops patrolled a stretch of street on foot, an area recently fully captured and thoroughly cleared by them earlier, upon the cessation of heavy firefights amid the rubble of former homes. Now, recently having concluded with the combo of either retreat, surrender, or death of the defending forces that were previously in this particular area. Richardson and those with him remained quiet. They desired to avoid any potential situations that could quickly go south for them. as they were outnumbered, tired, and largely lacked the ammo and types of weapons required to successfully wipe out potential threats in the form of PLA vehicles, which were no doubt close by, as these dismounted mechanized infantry troops signified this reality. The metro station was just beyond this section of two more streets from where they now currently sat. That was the only conceivable way out of this dilemma they currently found themselves in and brutally dealing with. There was an intersecting street up to the north from the front yard of a former home that they'd crawled carefully and quietly through and into its yard, its front yard, which was littered with enough of the former home to where they could lay flat in the prone position to hide therein amid the rubble. This was truly a very high-stakes endeavor. All it could take to perish was one small revealing mistake on any of the men's parts. Anytime a column of patrolling troops ventured somewhat close by on the street, they feigned death, laying as still as conceivably possible, as there'd been many of those who'd fallen there earlier in battle, who were not yet removed, as time hadn't yet permitted such, for either side to conduct corpse retrievals in areas that they controlled. This mostly due to the tempo of the battle still being too fast and fluid to where the practicality of this wasn't even a realistic thought in anyone's minds as it related to cleaning up the dead. Thus, all the better for remaining stealthy amid such a major battle. Sergeant Richardson would determine when it'd be safe to move. However, determining enemy patterns and strength in the immediate area determined their next course of action. Once it could all be realized and memorized, if such a thing existed, as it was possible that it might all be random in terms of numbers, capabilities, and patrol patterns as well, including in that the weapons available in terms of the factor of capabilities was concerned. The men lay in wait for many minutes. Nearly 30 minutes had elapsed by the time it had been decided to make a move. Certainly, being it was during the night made things easier due to the general tunnel vision caused by the night vision goggles that the PLA troops wore upon their helmets. Although it was likewise the same for the Americans wearing theirs, due to the lack of any adequate peripheral vision that naturally comes with wearing such equipment. Quietly, Sergeant Richardson whispered to the two men nearest him, "Okay, that's the last squad. It just passed now. It's probably about 300 meters down the street to the south. Our left. We need to run north before they or another squad comes from the south. Don't see any troops or vehicles, just to our direct north. I hope I'm right, but we have no other choice. If I'm wrong, either, he said, telling them to pass along the information as well as to watch for his hand signals to move and follow him to the other troops that were behind. There was a general temporary lull in the fighting in this immediate part of the city, which in military terms usually meant that logistics were either being replenished, along with a small rest period for the troops before another major assault, or the forces were preparing to redeploy altogether to a whole other zone or area, or a mix of both. Either way, it was now or potentially never. The noises of battle were still heard erupting in other parts of the city, but in this zone, it had calmed down into an occasional machine gun burst here or there, or a few rifles popping off. Nothing, though, like the savage events earlier that had shaken, literally so, and ripped this part of the city, of the metro area, to its very foundations. "Go! Go!" whispered Sergeant Richardson, while giving the move out hand sign for those further back to see. There was no delays, as all the men mustered the strength left that they had and ran relatively quietly. Left where they were and ran quietly along the rubbled street. Their immediate objective, a left turn at the intersecting street, which lay only 100 meters away to their north. Part 14 will be continued next.